The rain didn't fall, it lingered, pressing itself against the tall windows of Whitestone Tech Tower, like a silent question no one dared to answer. The city of Chicago shimmered far below, a blur of grays and golds filtered through the storm. On the 72nd floor, Ethan Whitestone sat in a black leather chair, motionless, his silhouette carved in stillness against the city skyline. He could have been mistaken for a sculpture, beautiful, cold, and entirely unreachable. The office was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of rain and the low hum of a computer screen, casting an artificial glow across his sharp features. Ethan's eyes, once a subject of admiration in business magazines for their intensity, now looked hollow, as if emptied out by time itself. He wasn't reading the screen anymore. He had already memorized the words. The sentence had etched itself into the inner walls of his skull with cruel permanence in glioblastomony inoperabile submitted survival. 12 to 24 months. The words had arrived, not with a scream, but with silence, a kind of silence that suffocated him more than any prognosis. For a man who had built one of the most powerful tech empires in North America, who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, the diagnosis wasn't just an ending, it was an insult, a reminder that even the most calculated life could be undone by something microscopic and merciless. Ethan's hands curled over the arms of the chair, fingers digging into the leather. He was dying, and not in a dramatic, Hollywood ending sort of way, in the slow, undignified, shrinking way that stripped men of power, memory, identity. His empire would survive him, of course. The press would call him a visionary. The obituaries would line his legacy with platinum words. But when the wind stopped speaking his name, who would carry it forward? Who would remember not just Ethan the CEO, but Ethan the boy who once watched his mother play piano in a room filled with sunlight? The thought arrived with terrifying clarity. A child. He didn't need a wife. He didn't want a love story. He needed blood. Someone to anchor him in this world once he was gone. A continuation, not of affection, but of permanence. He leaned forward, clicked a button, and summoned his lawyer. Draft the paperwork. I want a surrogate. No strings, no custody complications. I want full parental rights. $5 million upon delivery. Discretion is absolute. Victor Haynes, who had worked with Ethan for nearly a decade, didn't blink. Understood. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Across the city, in a crowded hospital room filled with antiseptic air and beeping machines, Clara Jensen sat beside her younger brother, Noah. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the white hospital sheets, and his breaths came in shallow rhythms that made her feel like she was constantly holding her own. 15 years old, he looked far younger now, his once animated face dimmed by fatigue and endless rounds of chemo. She reached for a damp cloth and gently wiped his forehead, careful not to disturb the 4 lines running from his thin arms. It's snowing again, she whispered, trying to inject some normalcy into the sterile room. You always liked the first snow. Noah smiled weakly, his voice barely audible. Only if there's hot chocolate. Clara blinked back tears and forced a smile. Then, when you're better, we'll drink an entire pot. But they both knew the truth. Time was running out. His leukemia had returned with fury, and the only hope left was a specialized bone marrow transplant. The procedure was costly. Even after selling her cello, her apartment, and taking every job she could find from wedding musician to private music tutor, she was still thousands away. Hope, like breath, had become a scarce resource. That afternoon, her phone rang. Clara didn't recognize the number, but something in her gut told her to answer. Miss Jensen, her voice inquired, calm and clipped. This is Victor Haynes, legal counsel to Mr. Ethan Whitestone. My client has an offer for you. She stepped into the hallway, clutching her coat tighter. I'm not sure. It's regarding financial assistance. For your brother's medical expenses, Mr. Whitestone is prepared to cover the full cost. In addition, he's offering $5 million. Silence. Clara's heart thudded like a drum. What? What does he want? A contractual agreement. You would serve as surrogate and carry Mr. Whitestone's biological child to term. The contract includes housing, full medical care, and strict terms of confidentiality. The child would be raised solely by Mr. Whitestone. You would relinquish all parental rights. Clara pressed a hand to her stomach, as if steadying herself. Why me? Because Mr. Whitestone doesn't believe in luck, the lawyer replied. Evenly, he believes in probability. You're healthy. you're financially strained, and most importantly, you're willing to do anything for someone you love. A pause. You have 24 hours. We'll send a car in the morning if you agree. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat by Noah's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall. She thought about their childhood, about how he used to sneak into her rehearsals and beg her to play the Jurassic Park theme, about how he clung to her after their parents' funeral, about how she'd promised over and over that she wouldn't let anything happen to him. This wasn't just about $5 million, it was about keeping a promise. The next morning, she stepped into the sleek black car waiting at the curb. The drive downtown was quiet. The tower seemed even taller up close, piercing the storm-heavy clouds above, like it had been built to challenge the sky itself. She was ushered into a marble conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like she was floating above the world. Ethan sat at the far end, dressed in black, eyes unreadable. He didn't stand, didn't smile. He merely slid a folder toward her. "This is the contract," he said. "It's comprehensive. You'll reside in my estate for the duration. All medical care and monitoring will be provided on site. Payment will be delivered in full upon successful birth. My name will be on the certificate. Yours will not." Clara opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the clauses, emotionless language outlining custody waivers, liability disclaimers, and termination contingencies. But it was one clause that made her heart stutter. The surrogate agrees to no emotional bond or expectation of relationship with the child, or with the client. She looked up, searching his face. "What do you see when you look at me?" His response was cold. "A solution." She closed the folder. "Noah is everything to me," she said quietly. "This ... will save him. So do it. But don't ever mistake my silence for agreement. I'm not a solution. I'm a person." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his jaw tightened. "You move in tomorrow," he said. She signed the last page and stood. Her hands trembled, but her spine stayed straight. As she stepped out into the rain, she whispered to herself, "I'll survive this. For Noah, and maybe for something more." Behind her, on the 72nd floor, Ethan stared at the signature on the page. Clara Jensen, and felt something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, but he pushed it down. This was business, nothing more. Or so he told himself. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through the morning like a warning, cold and unrelenting, sweeping in waves over the estate grounds as the car turned onto the long, graveled drive. Trees stood like solemn guards, stripped bare by late autumn, their branches clawing at the grey sky above. When Clara Jensen first laid eyes on Ethan Whitestone's home, it struck her not as a mansion, but as a mausoleum, towering and modern, with endless panels of glass and stone. The estate exuded silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that devoured warmth. The gates closed behind her with a hiss. Clara stepped out, her suitcase in one hand, her backpack with folded sheet music slung over the other. She was escorted inside without ceremony, her boots echoing across the polished floors like an intruder's footsteps. The interior of the estate was immaculate, the kind of clean that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with absence. The walls were white. The furniture was monochrome. No books on the shelves. No family photos on the mantels. It was as if the house had been built to repel memory. She was greeted not by Ethan, but by a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Winslow, late 50s, severe bun, and the kind of posture that made you sit up straighter without knowing why. "This way," she said, her tone flat, her eyes never really meeting Clara's. "You'll be staying on the second floor. Follow the rules and everything will go smoothly." She handed Clara a typed sheet with precision, as if she had given it out before. Clara scanned it quickly. "Do not enter the West Wing. Do not ask questions about Mr. Whitestone's schedule or personal life. Do not appear in the dining room unless summoned. No guests. No loud noise. No music. No unnecessary movement after 9 p.m. Clara folded the page and tucked it into her coat. She wanted to ask who had written these rules. She wanted to ask what kind of man needed silence as a condition for human presence, but she didn't. There would be time for questions. Maybe. Mrs. Winslow led her down a corridor and opened the door to a guest suite. It was pristine, a soft bed, clean white linens, a walk-in closet too large for the few belongings Clara had brought. There were no flowers, no books, no art, Only one thing stood out: a cello-shaped case on a high shelf in the corner, half hidden by a folded throw. Clara blinked, unsure if her imagination was playing tricks. "Is that—" Mrs. Winslow glanced toward it, then away. "It's been here a long time. No one touches it." Clara said nothing, but her pulse skipped. Once the door closed behind her, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. The air smelled like lemon oil and untouched stone. She ran a hand over her stomach, flat now, but harboring the beginning of a miracle wrapped in complexity and silence, and $5 million she didn't even want to think about. She turned her head and whispered, "This is temporary. We're only passing through." The first days passed in rigid quiet. Meals were delivered to her door with mechanical politeness. Medical staff came and went for daily checkups, efficient and impersonal. Ethan never appeared. Clara only saw traces of him: half-empty teacups on the kitchen counter, a black coat folded on the arm of a chair, a stack of business journals left perfectly aligned on the hallway table. She tried not to explore, not out of obedience, but out of instinct. The house felt like a shrine to control, and she didn't want to disturb the ghosts that lived there. Instead, she found solace in her evening rituals: writing letters to Noah she never sent, reading by the window while the wind howled across the lake, and replaying memories like lullabies in her mind. But the silence was unrelenting. It pressed into her ears, heavy and thick, until she couldn't take it anymore. One sleepless night, unable to lie still, Clara slipped out of her room. The hallways glowed faintly under soft recessed lighting. She padded barefoot past the stairs, toward the living room she'd only glimpsed before. There, nestled in the far corner near a pane of glass overlooking the lake, was a grand piano, black, glossy, untouched, and beside it on a stand, like it had never been moved, a cello. Her breath caught. She stepped toward it slowly, reverently, as if approaching a sacred relic. It wasn't hers, but it looked like it could have been. Same curve in the shoulder, same faded stain along the lower bout. Without thinking, she lifted it from its rest and pulled it close. She didn't play to make a statement. She didn't even play loudly. She played because it was the only thing in the world that still felt like truth. A low, trembling note filled the space. Then another. Her fingers remembered the dance, her bow sliding with muscle memory and ache. She played the melody she used to sing to Noah when he was too afraid to sleep. She played it softly, like a secret, like a prayer, and then a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stop." She turned. Ethan stood in the hallway, his frame backlit by cold light. He was barefoot, in black pants and a sweater rolled at the sleeves, and yet somehow he still looked like the kind of man who could make steel tremble. Clara lowered the bow, her breath uneven. "I'm sorry I couldn't sleep. You're not here to play music. I'm not here to be a prisoner either." His jaw tightened. "That instrument doesn't belong to you." Her eyes didn't leave his. "No, but it knows me." Ethan said nothing for a moment, then stepped forward and closed the piano lid with an eerie gentleness. "No music in this house. Not anymore." He turned and walked away. Clara stood in the silence he left behind. Her hands trembled, but her spine did not bend. She gently returned the cello to its stand and whispered, "That's not a rule I agreed to." The next morning, she woke to find the cello gone, not moved. Vanished. That day, something shifted. She stopped waiting for warmth from the house. Instead, she made it. She opened the window slightly when she brewed tea. She left behind folded notes with lines of music, just a few bars here and there slipped into books on the shelves. She kept a journal and named each entry after the emotion she refused to bury. Hope, defiance, stillness, ache. She called Noah every day, even when he couldn't speak much, even when he was too weak to laugh. Just hearing his breath made her believe in days ahead. She played music again, not with the cello, but in her mind. She composed lullabies for the babies growing inside her, humming them in the shower, or whispering them against the walls when no one could hear. It didn't matter if Ethan forbade it. Music had always saved her. She believed, quietly and without condition, that it could save him too. She didn't expect miracles. She just wanted to leave something behind that would echo, even in silence. One night, 2 weeks after arriving, Clara found something unexpected on her door. A folded sheet of paper. No message, just a title, handwritten in rough black ink. First Light. She opened it. It was a melody, crude but unmistakably heartfelt. A lullaby, barely formed, its structure shaky, the rhythm uneven. But there was something familiar in it, something that echoed the note she'd played that night by the window, as if someone had been listening more closely than they let on. She didn't play it, not yet. She tucked it into her journal and smiled. There were still rules in the house of Whitestone, but somewhere, deep within its silence, a voice had begun to tremble, and that was enough for now. 5 days had passed since Clara Jensen first stepped into the quiet void of the Whitestone estate, and already the silence had begun to take shape more than absence, more than stillness. It was something living, something watchful, the kind of silence that curled beneath doors and whispered down hallways like a secret you weren't supposed to hear. She had adjusted, at least outwardly. She knew when the housekeeper would knock. She knew the exact time the medical technician would arrive, gloves snapping, voice clinical, and she knew she wouldn't see Ethan, not during breakfast, not in the corridors, not even in the study, when she passed it at night and glimpsed a flicker of lamplight beneath the door. And yet, he was everywhere. In the symmetry of the house, in the immaculately organized kitchen drawers, in the emptiness of every shelf that looked as if something had once lived there and been quietly erased. Clara moved through the house like a guest in someone else's grief. She filled her own emptiness by clinging to the voice of her brother. Noah's health had stabilized enough for short conversations each morning. His voice soft but threaded with strength she didn't think possible weeks ago. "I made a drawing today," he said over the phone, his voice fuzzy with static and chemo. "It's you, playing music, for the babies." Clara smiled, her hand resting over the gentle swell of her abdomen. "One day, you'll meet them, and I'll play for all 3 of you, promise, with my whole heart." It was these moments that kept her afloat. These calls, these gentle fragments of love, tethered to a world outside the glass and marble tomb she now inhabited. That afternoon, with the wind humming low across Lake Michigan, Clara wandered deeper into the house than she ever had before. She wasn't exploring, she was surviving. And survival, in this place, required movement steps forward, even into rooms where doors had long remained closed. She found herself on the 3rd floor, in a hallway narrower than the rest. The carpet beneath her feet had dulled with time, and the walls here bore none of the glossy sterility of the lower levels. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar and locked, unguarded, but edged with stillness so heavy it made her pause. It wasn't curiosity that pulled her forward, it was intuition, some quiet nudge of her soul that told her what lay behind that door mattered. She pushed it open gently. The room inside was small, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light that poured through a half-shuttered window. Everything in it felt untouched for years. A wooden easel stood in one corner, holding a canvas smeared with unfinished colors, blues and greens forming what might have become a garden. A shelf held a collection of old books, yellowing with age, spines softened with use. On a small side table sat a porcelain teacup, cracked but unbroken. Next to it, a faded photograph in a silver frame. Clara stepped closer. The woman in the photo had green eyes, warm and laughing, with dark hair swept into a loose bun. She stood beside a younger version of Ethan, maybe 10 years old, his head tucked against her shoulder, his face open and unguarded. Clara recognized the boy instantly, but the expression was one she had never seen on the man he had become. There was joy in that picture, and beside it, a box of letters, tied with a thin blue ribbon. She hesitated. Then, as if drawn by something larger than herself, she untied the ribbon and pulled the first letter free. The handwriting was elegant, slightly slanted, and written in blue ink, now faded at the edges. "My dearest Ethan, you don't have to be the strongest man in every room. You only have to be the one who tries. I wish I could shield you from the coldness of this world, but if I cannot, then let this music, this love, be your armor. Let it remind you who you are." Clara stopped reading. Her throat ached. She set the letter down gently and sat in the worn armchair near the window, feeling the weight of the room settle around her. This was not a forgotten storage space. This was a place preserved in grief, untouched, not because it had been dismissed, but because it had meant too much. Ethan's mother had lived here in this room, or in its memory, and when she left this world, she took something from her son that had never returned. Clara looked at the unfinished painting again. The garden on the canvas was vibrant, alive, a dream of color and growth. This room had once been filled with music, with love. Now it was filled only with absence. She left it as gently as she'd entered, her footsteps quieter now, her understanding deeper. That evening, at dinner, the silence stretched long across the table. For once, Ethan sat with her, though his eyes remained fixed on his tablet, scrolling through reports. She doubted he even read. Clara watched him. Not the surface of him, the composed face, the expensive shirt, the measured stillness. She looked deeper, at the man who had once smiled beside his mother, at the boy who had painted gardens and kept letters. "I found a room today," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the clinking of silverware. He didn't look up. There was a photograph of you and a woman with green eyes. She looked like she loved you. The reaction was immediate. Ethan's hand slammed the tablet to the table with a crack that echoed through the dining room. He stood, not with fury, but with pain so raw it masked itself as anger. "You had no right. I wasn't judging. You had no right to go through my life." Clara didn't flinch. "I wasn't going through anything. I was remembering, with you, whether you want me to or not." "You're a surrogate," he snapped. "Not a confidant. Not a guest. You're here for one reason. Don't overstep." She met his eyes and held them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was electric, filled with unshed tears, unspoken confessions, and a chasm of years neither of them had dared cross. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but you looked like someone who hadn't been seen in a long time, and I wanted you to know. I saw you." Ethan turned without a word and left the dining room. His footsteps down the hall sounded like thunder. Clara stayed seated, her hand still around her glass of water. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had touched. She had seen the wound, she had spoken to the wound, and it had bled. That night, Clara didn't cry. She didn't replay the scene over and over in self. She simply lay awake, hands over her stomach, humming the melody of the unfinished lullaby she'd started writing weeks ago. The one with no words, just hope. In another part of the house, Ethan sat in his mother's old chair in the third room. He held the letter Clara had read, its paper still warm from her hands. "Why does she make me remember what I buried?" The cello, the piano, the easel, all of it had been silent for so long, and now her presence brought everything back like a flood. He hadn't prepared for. He wanted to despise her for it, but he couldn't. Not when her voice was the first to call him human in years. Not when her eyes saw through every layer of armor he had spent a lifetime building. He returned to his study and opened the drawer where he kept half-finished things. Pieces of music, fragments of childhood sketches, words he once wrote and never sent. He pulled out a composition notebook, flipped past pages dated in grief, and found the melody Clara had hummed the first night she touched the cello. Slowly, he added to it, a harmony here, a chord progression there, the beginnings of something neither of them could name yet. The next morning, Clara stepped into the living room and froze. The old grand piano, silent and untouched since she'd arrived, was gone. In its place stood a new instrument, jet black. Its lacquered surface gleamed in the morning light, a freshly tuned grand piano. On the music stand sat a small card, no name. No message, just a signature in bold black ink, E. Whitestone. Clara reached out and touched the keys. One soft note rose into the quiet like a heartbeat. She smiled faintly, knowing she wasn't forgiven. Not yet, but the rules had changed. Somewhere deep in the house of ghosts, a new sound had begun to echo, and it was hers. The first snow came. Quietly, it dusted the grounds of the Whitestone estate in a fine, almost invisible film, softening the stone and steel that made up Ethan's fortress into something that, if only from a distance, resembled a home. Clara Jensen stood at the tall windows of the east hallway, her fingertips pressed to the cold glass, watching the lake blur into the sky. She had not played since the new piano arrived, not because she didn't want to, but because silence had taken on a new form in this house. It was no longer a command. It had become a question, suspended between them like an unfinished phrase. That morning, as she moved through her usual routine tea, a call to Noah, a slow walk around the garden path before it froze completely, something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but her body was shifting, not just from the child, or rather, the children growing inside her, but from something softer, something unnamed. When the call came from the doctor's office, she sat down slowly in the breakfast nook and listened with both hands pressed to her abdomen. "Congratulations, Miss Jensen," the voice said through the speakerphone. "You're carrying twins. Both are healthy. Early, of course, but everything looks promising." Clara's throat closed. She murmured, "Thank you," ended the call. and stared out at the white blanket of snow that had now begun to settle on the hedges. 2 heartbeats. 2 lives. The gravity of it hit her like music, sudden, layered, beautiful. She didn't knock, she didn't plan it. She simply walked to Ethan's study and stood in the doorway. He was reading something on his laptop, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him. He looked up. "The doctor called," she said gently, holding her voice steady. "Twins, a boy and a girl." Ethan blinked once. "Good," he said, as though she had told him a shipment had arrived on time. She waited just long enough for disappointment to bloom in her chest, and then she nodded and turned to go. "Wait." She paused. He stood, crossed the room, and picked up a folder from the side table. He handed it to her. Inside were pages of handwritten sheet music. Clara read the title Lullaby for Tomorrow and felt the world tilt beneath her. "You wrote this?" "It's simple," Ethan said, almost apologetically. "I'm not a composer." "It's beautiful," she replied, her voice tight. "Can I play it?" He hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. They walked together in silence to the music room. The new piano gleamed under the winter light, untouched until now. She sat down, smoothed the pages across the stand, and began to play. The melody was sparse, hesitant at first, but there was honesty in its restraint, as if every note had been measured not by theory, but by feeling long suppressed. Clara closed her eyes and poured herself into the spaces between the measures, filling them with warmth, with breath, with her own quiet yearning. When she finished, she turned. Ethan was still standing there, eyes fixed on the keys. "I think they'll love it," she whispered. "The twins." He didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. That was enough. The next morning, Clara woke early. Snow had thickened outside, turning the world into a white hush. She moved through the house quietly, gathering things from the pantry, the fridge, the spice drawer. She didn't ask permission. She simply listened to memory, to instinct, and began to cook. That it was a simple meal: toast, eggs, strawberries, and a pot of coffee brewed exactly the way she'd seen him do it, strong, no sugar. On the edge of the tray, she placed a folded note. Asterisk, asterisk, don't forget to take your medication today. C, asterisk, asterisk. She left it outside his study. Later that day, the tray returned empty. The note, however, was not discarded. It had been folded and tucked into the crease of the piano bench. She smiled to herself. The house, once indifferent, was beginning to respond. They didn't speak much over the next week, but something unspoken began to pass between them. A glance in the hallway that lingered too long. A shared moment by the fire when neither of them reached for a book. The comfort of two people who no longer needed words to understand that the air had changed. Then came the morning when Clara walked into the kitchen and found Ethan there already. "You're up early," she said, startled. He was barefoot, hair slightly mussed, sleeves rolled up. He was holding a carrot awkwardly over a cutting board. "I thought I'd help," he said. Clara blinked. "You cook?" "No, but I'm excellent at following instructions." She laughed light, surprised. "Then lesson 1, she said, walking over. "Hold the knife like this." She guided his hand over the handle, her fingers sliding against his. His breath caught just barely, but he didn't pull away. They made spaghetti. It was messy, the sauce too thick, the noodles overcooked. But when they sat at the table and tasted their creation, Ethan closed his eyes after the first bite. "This is the best thing I've had in years," he said. "Liar," Clara replied, smiling. "Truth," he insisted. "You don't know what hospital food does to a man." They laughed, not politely, not cautiously. They laughed like people who had started to forget how to be afraid. From that day, the quiet joy expanded. They built a playlist together, Clara's old favorites, pieces from Ethan's childhood, lullabies she was composing for the twins. They shared music the way others shared wine, reverently, intimately. The piano room became their chapel. Clara began to draw up nursery plans, sketching the space beside the music room. Ethan brought in an architect, not because he had to, but because he asked her what she dreamed of for the babies. She told him. They chose soft blue walls with painted stars, a shelf filled with classic children's books, a mobile of glowing constellations. On one of the shelves, Clara placed a framed ultrasound photo. Ethan stared at it longer than she expected. "I never thought I'd want this," he said quietly. She touched his hand. "You didn't know you were allowed to." One evening, after a snowball fight in the garden that ended with Clara laughing on the ground and Ethan covered in slush, they lay in the snow, side by side, their breath curling into the sky. "You make me forget everything," he said suddenly, his voice raw. "Everything that hurts." She turned to him, her cheeks flushed. "You make me remember," she whispered. "Everything that matters." He reached for her hand. She didn't let go. That night, when Ethan's headache returned, fierce and sharp, Clara found him standing by the bedroom window, shoulders tense, hand pressed to his temple. "Go back to sleep," he said, barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped beside him, wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, and rested her cheek against his back. "I'm here." He let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, his hand covered hers. In the dark, in the quiet, pain didn't disappear, but it softened, and in the morning, when the sun rose over the frozen lake, the first light spilled through the windows and onto the piano keys. Ethan sat alone, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. He reached for a sheet of blank music paper and began to write, not because he had to, but because he needed to, because she had taught him how. The days inside the Whitestone estate no longer passed in silence. They flowed, quiet but alive, threaded with soft music, the aroma of warm bread, and the subtle warmth of two people learning, awkwardly and imperfectly, how to coexist without armor. Clara Jensen no longer tiptoed down the hallways. Her footsteps had found rhythm. Her breath, once cautious, now moved with confidence, unafraid to disturb the air. And Ethan, though still wrapped in the stillness that had shaped him, no longer lived entirely inside it. He was present now in ways he hadn't been in years. He showed up for breakfast. He stayed to listen when Clara played. Sometimes, he even smiled, real, unguarded smiles that made her feel like she'd unlocked something sacred. One crisp afternoon, as frost clung to the windows and the lake outside gleamed with half-formed ice, Clara entered the garden alone. The old path wound beneath archways bare of flowers but filled with memory. She moved slowly, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, now visibly holding two small lives growing stronger by the day. Snow crunched beneath her boots. A single bird chirped somewhere in the trees, its voice defiant against the coming winter. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cold, and let the silence embrace her, not with absence, but with presence. Ethan found her there. He came without announcement, hands buried in the pockets of a grey wool coat, his breath visible in short clouds. She turned when she sensed him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "It's beautiful today," she said. "It is," he agreed, though his gaze wasn't on the sky or the trees. It was on her. They walked without speaking for several minutes, side by side, their steps in rhythm. The garden wrapped around them like a forgotten song, waiting to be remembered. Clara stopped beside a row of dormant rose bushes and ran her fingers along a bare branch. "Did you plant these?" "My mother did," Ethan said quietly. "She loved this garden. We used to water the roses together every summer. She believed that even when things looked dead, they weren't. They were just waiting." Clara's fingers stilled on the branch. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She was light," he said, and the word trembled slightly on his tongue. "She sang to me when I couldn't sleep, played piano when I was sick. She made the world feel softer." And when she was gone, he didn't answer, but she could see it in his eyes. He had spent years building walls from grief, stacking logic and wealth and silence to fill the hole her death left behind. Clara reached out, brushed his hand with hers. "You never really left this garden, did you?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his hand turned, and his fingers laced through hers. They stood there, still and quiet, connected not by conversation but by the weight of everything they'd both lost, and everything they might still find. Back inside, they sat by the fire, a blanket over their laps, mugs of tea warming their hands. Clara glanced at Ethan, the firelight painting gold across his cheek. "If you had only 100 days left to live," she asked, "what would you do with them?" Ethan didn't respond. At first, he stared into the flames as though trying to read a truth written in the flicker. "I don't know," he said eventually. "For so long, everything I did was about control. Controlling outcomes, people, even time. I built Whitestone Tech from nothing because I couldn't handle what I couldn't fix. I told myself it was purpose." He looked at her then, and his eyes were naked, stripped of defense. But it was fear. Fear of being nothing. Fear of loving someone and not being enough. Clara held his gaze, and now, He shook his head. Now, I don't know what I want. Part of me just wants it over. Quick, clean, so I don't have to keep hoping. Her heart ached not just for him, but for the child he once was, for the boy who stood in his mother's garden, learning how to water roses. When I was little, Clara said, my mother used to talk about Carnegie Hall like it was heaven. She said that when music reached that stage, it didn't die, became immortal. Ethan smiled faintly. Did you ever play there? No. I was supposed to audition after graduation, but then she died, and Noah was still so young. I took care of him instead. She touched her stomach. But I never stopped dreaming of it. I just tucked it away until I could carry it again. Ethan leaned closer. What does it feel like, to still want something that much? It feels like breathing, she said, even when it hurts. There was a silence then, not heavy, but sacred. And then Ethan said, I envy that. She looked at him. I envy your courage. You've been handed loss after loss, and you still choose to hope. Clara reached across the space between them, and laid her hand gently over his. You don't have to leave a monument behind, Ethan. You just have to stay in the moment. He turned his palm upward, closed his fingers around hers. But what if I let myself feel this and then I die? She smiled sadly. Then you'll have died knowing you were alive. Tears sprang to his eyes. He looked away. She didn't speak again. She just let her presence fill the space, steady and unwavering. That night, she found a note slipped under her door. Asterisk, asterisk, you asked what I'd do with 100 days. I'd spend everyone listening to you play. Asterisk, asterisk. Clara held it to her chest and wept quietly, not out of grief but out of something even rarer. Faith. They spent the next week, living without a script. Each morning Clara made breakfast and left little notes by his coffee cups, sometimes silly, sometimes soulful. Ethan, in return, began to leave small surprises. A book of poetry on her chair, a newly tuned violin in the music room, a watercolor set she hadn't touched in years. They painted the nursery together. At first, they argued about colors. He wanted white, she wanted blue. They compromised sky blue, soft enough to sleep under, deep enough to dream. They added glow-in-the-dark stars to the ceiling. Ethan grumbled as he stuck them on, but Clara saw the quiet wonder in his eyes when the lights went off and the ceiling came alive. We're building a galaxy, she said. He turned to her, his face lit by plastic stars. Then, you're my north. She laughed, kissed his cheek, and felt his breath catch. One day, while Clara stood in the garden watering the rose bushes his mother once tended, Ethan stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. You make the silence feel like music, he whispered. She leaned into him. And you make grief feel like it might end. Later that night, under a silver moon, they stood by the tree Clara had planted weeks ago. Hope it had begun to bud. Against all odds, its branches reaching shyly toward the sky. He took her hands. You make me want to stay, to see them grow, to hold you while they fall asleep, to dance in the kitchen, to live. She reached up and touched his cheek. Then live, Ethan, not for me, not for them, but for yourself. He kissed her finally, fully, without reservation, without walls. And in that kiss, Clara felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Belonging not to a place, not to a role, but to a person, to a story that was still unfolding, one heartbeat at a time. The snow had started to melt. Tiny rivulets carved paths through the white blanket outside the Whitestone estate, uncovering patches of grass long buried beneath winter's hush. Inside, the world was warm. Clara Jensen stood in the nursery, brushing her fingers over the edge of a newly built cradle. Ethan had carved it himself. It wasn't perfect, the corners slightly uneven, the wood grain showing, but it was real. A piece of him, made not with wealth or strategy, but with his hands. She traced the carved initials at the base AW and CW, Aria Whitestone chord. Whitestone. They had names now, names that held a future. She turned toward the window, watching Ethan in the garden. He was laying fresh seed into the thawing earth, gloves on, shoulders tense but determined. He had taken to gardening as though digging into the soil would anchor him to something stronger than time. Clara watched him, her chest tightening with an emotion she hadn't yet named. It lived somewhere between hope and dread, because even as life bloomed around them, the truth pressed in. Ethan's tumor wasn't shrinking. They hadn't spoken of it directly in days, but the quiet was different now. It wasn't avoidance. It was shared fear. The call came late that afternoon, just as Clara was finishing a melody in the music room. Ethan answered on speaker, his voice steady, but his eyes fixed on her, as if bracing for impact. Dr. Renner's voice filled the air. The latest scans aren't promising. The tumor is progressing more rapidly than anticipated. We may have weeks. Clara's hands gripped the edge of the piano. Ethan simply said, "Thank you," and ended the call. For a moment, neither moved. The silence was so complete, it felt holy. Then he stood and walked to the window. She followed him. "He knew," she whispered. He nodded. "And you didn't tell me. I didn't want to steal this from you." Clara's heart cracked open. "You are not a thief. You're the father of my children. The man who gave me a home. You don't get to decide how I grieve." He looked at her then, eyes wide with pain. "I didn't want to watch you say goodbye to me. Not while you still had to carry them. I thought, if I could just get you to the finish line, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much." Clara stepped closer. "Ethan, I'd rather walk beside you through pain than be protected from it alone." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I can't watch them grow up. I won't be there for first steps, or lullabies, or prom nights. I can't protect you, or them." "You don't have to protect us," she said softly. "You just have to love us, while you're still here." He let out a breath like surrender and sank into the armchair. Clara knelt in front of him, placed his hand over her belly. "Feel them." He did. 2 tiny kicks answered his touch. "They know you," she whispered. "They already know you." Tears slipped down Ethan's cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. That night, she found him in the nursery, painting stars onto the ceiling. "I thought you hated this part," she said gently. He smiled, paintbrush in hand. "I do, but I hate missing more." She stepped in, wrapped her arms around his waist, and pressed her cheek to his back. "When the time comes," he said, "I want you to tell them everything. Don't sugarcoat it. Tell them I was angry and scared. Tell them I made mistakes, but tell them I stayed. I will. Tell them I fell in love with their mother, not because she saved me, but because she saw me, even when I was trying to disappear. I promise." She reached for his hand, and together they painted the last constellation. Days turned to weeks. Ethan grew thinner. The headaches returned more frequently, stealing hours from him, but he never once let them steal his presence. He held Clara's hand through doctor visits. He played music by her side even when his fingers trembled. He recorded lullabies for the twins, one for each, his voice soft, words written like prayers. One morning, Clara woke to find him standing in the middle of the living room, suit pressed, bag packed. "What are you doing?" she asked, heart racing. "There's a clinical trial in Boston. Dr. Renner made the referral. It's risky, but it might buy me time." She blinked, stunned. "You said you were done chasing miracles." "I was," he said, stepping forward, "until I realized I have something to fight for." He reached for her hands, placed a kiss on her fingers. "I want to live, Clara. I want to live for you, for them, even if it's just one more day." She didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." They flew to Boston the next morning. The hospital felt cold, sterile too, much like the past they'd both escaped. But Clara stayed by his side through every test, every needle, every night filled with uncertainty. When the treatment began, Ethan was the one comforting her. "It's not the end," he'd whisper. "It's just another page." And when the side effects hit, nausea, fatigue, pain, he tried to mask. Clara didn't leave. She sat by his bed and played the cello, soft and low, weaving notes like a blanket around him. On the 3rd night, he woke from a fever dream, drenched in sweat, eyes wild. "I'm scared." She took his face in her hands. "So am I, but fear doesn't mean we stop." He exhaled shakily. "If I don't make it, don't." She cut in. "We talk about that if it happens, but not before." He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, he fell asleep without flinching. After 10 days, the doctors reviewed the first signs of progress. The tumor had slowed, not reversed, not vanished, but slowed. It was enough to go home, enough to hope back. In Chicago, the nursery was waiting. The garden was blooming again. The cradle sat beneath a mobile of stars. Ethan stepped into the house and looked around, like he was seeing it for the first time. "It smells like cinnamon," he said. "It's ginger tea," Clara replied. "For nausea." He smiled. They curled up on the couch that night, blankets over their legs, her head on his shoulder. "I thought I was ready to die," he whispered. "And now, I want to hear them cry. I want to hold them, even if it's just once." Clara squeezed his hand. You'll have more than once. He turned to her. What if I don't? Then we make the moments we have enough to fill a lifetime. She kissed him, slowly, deeply. A promise passed between lips. And in the quiet that followed, their breathing synced, and their hearts beat not as to people bound by tragedy, but as one family bound by choice. The wind swept through Chicago with a force that rattled the windows, whistled through the trees, and echoed down the marble hallways of the Whitestone estate. It was the kind of wind that announced change, unforgiving, inevitable. Clara Jensen stood in the nursery, tracing the rim of a glass snow globe that sat on the bookshelf. Inside, 2 deer huddled beneath a tree as white glitter danced around them. It had been a gift from Ethan just a week ago. A storm always passes, he had told her then. It's what waits on the other side that matters. But something in his eyes had told a different story. He had grown quieter again. Not in the cold, unreachable way he had once been, but in a deeper, more haunted way. As though part of him had stepped backward while the rest clung forward. The trial in Boston had slowed the tumor, but it had not erased time. And time, Clara had learned, was never generous twice. Now, as she stood alone in the nursery, she heard the unmistakable sound of Ethan's voice rising in another room. Up, clipped. She followed the sound down the hallway. When she reached the library, she froze at the doorway. A woman stood inside. Tall, elegant, blonde. Her presence was like glass, stunning, but dangerous to touch. Victoria. Clara recognized her instantly, though they had never formally met. Her name had been whispered only once between them, years gone. Ethan's past sealed behind layers. Clara never pried open, but she was here now, standing across from Ethan, her voice low but intense. You didn't call, Victoria said. I had to hear it from someone else, that you're dying, that you moved on. I didn't call because there was nothing left to say, Ethan replied. Clara remained hidden in the hallway, her heart beating fast. Victoria stepped closer. You promised me forever, Ethan. You don't get to rewrite that because of a diagnosis. Ethan's jaw tightened. That was 5 years ago. You left. I left because you shut me out. Because every time I tried to touch the pain, you pretended it didn't exist. You built your grief into a fortress and told me to live in the cold, and now you think you can just walk back in. I want to help, she said. You want the version of me you remember, but that version doesn't exist anymore. And her, Victoria's voice hardened. She's not your wife. She was a contract, a means to an end. That child, those children, Ethan corrected, are mine. And she is more than you ever were. The silence that followed cut sharper than any scream. Clara stepped back before they saw her and returned to the nursery, her hands trembling. She didn't cry. Not yet, but something inside her wavered. Not because she doubted Ethan, but because she had seen what grief could do to a man who never learned how to let it go. That night, Ethan didn't mention Victoria's visit. He acted as if the day had passed, like any other, helping Clara into bed, setting a cup of warm milk on the nightstand, pressing a kiss to her temple before slipping into sleep beside her. But his silence spoke in shadows. In the middle of the night, Clara woke to find his side of the bed empty. She found him in the music room, staring out the window, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. Couldn't sleep, she asked gently. He didn't turn. I dreamt of my mother. Clara sat down beside the piano. Tell me. She was sitting at the edge of my hospital bed, humming. I asked her if it would hurt when I died. She said no, that it would feel like falling into light. Clara swallowed the knot in her throat. Do you believe her? I don't know, but it felt real. He looked at her then. I'm scared again, Clara. Not of dying, but of not finishing the story we started. She stood and walked to him, taking the glass from his hand and setting it aside. We still have time, she whispered. But the next morning, the fear returned, not in Ethan, but in her. It started as a sharp pain in her side. Then blood. Too much blood. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Ethan rode beside her, gripping her hand as though it anchored him to earth. Don't close your eyes, he said. Stay with me. She tried to speak, but couldn't. At the hospital, voices blurred, lights flashed. She was rushed into emergency care. Ethan waited in the hallway, fists clenched, his face pale. Hours passed. Dr. Renner appeared at last, his face grave. She's stable. We were able to stop the bleeding. The babies are safe, but we need to monitor her closely. Stress is a factor, and she's been under a lot. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were hollow. He stepped into her room just as she woke. "You stayed," she whispered, voice dry. "Always," he said. She smiled faintly. "I think the babies wanted to remind me that this isn't just my body anymore." He kissed her hand. They have their mother's flair for dramatic entrances. They stayed in the hospital 3 more days. During that time, Victoria sent flowers. Ethan threw them out. On the 3rd morning, Clara woke to find a small notebook on her bedside table. Inside were letters, one to Aria, one to Cord, and one to her. Ethan had written them late at night, when she slept. The letter to her read, "If I go before I say everything. No, this sigh didn't fall in love with you because you carried my children. I fell because you looked at me like I wasn't broken. And in your music I heard the version of myself I thought had died." Clara pressed the page to her lips, tears falling silently. They returned home under grey skies, but the house felt different. No longer a fortress or a waiting room for grief. It was a home. And when Ethan walked her inside and helped her onto the couch, she realized home wasn't the place. It was him, even if time was short, even if storms still lingered, because love, she understood now, wasn't a cure, but it was the only medicine that made the end bearable and the beginning worth fighting for. The air in Chicago had shifted. Spring had arrived quietly, melting the last remnants of snow and brushing the skies with pale light. But inside the Whitestone estate, time moved more slowly. Clara Jensen could feel it in every breath, every step, every glance between her and Ethan. After her hospitalization, the doctors had placed her on near-complete bed rest, and though she hated feeling helpless, she obeyed, not for herself but for the twins, and for Ethan, whose silent panic was more palpable now than ever before. Ethan became her shadow. He checked every meal, adjusted pillows a dozen times, read to her even when she pretended to sleep. He never said it aloud, but she knew he was trying to make the moments count, in case the clock stopped early for either of them. One night, Clara awoke to find the nursery light on. She rose slowly, careful of her balance, and padded down the hall. Inside, she found Ethan seated in the rocking chair. In his lap was the notebook, the one where he wrote letters, thoughts, fragments of truth he didn't yet know how to speak aloud. The room was dim, filled with the soft hum of a lullaby playing from a music box. He didn't hear her at first, not until she said gently, "Can't sleep." He looked up, startled. "You shouldn't be out of bed. I needed to see you." He looked away, his fingers stilling on the edge of a page. "I've been trying to imagine them, what they'll look like, who they'll become. I don't want to be just a photograph, or a bedtime story." "You won't be," she whispered. "But what if I am?" Clara stepped forward, her hands cupping his face. "Then I will make you more than that. I'll tell them how your hands trembled when you felt their first kick, how you painted stars on the ceiling even though you hated heights, how you built a cradle with your own 2 hands because you believed they deserved something real." Ethan closed his eyes, his breath catching. "I just wanted to give you all a future," he said. "You did," she replied. "You still are." In the days that followed, something changed. Not in the test results, those remained uncertain, but in Ethan himself. He began sorting through boxes stored in the attic, boxes that hadn't been opened since his mother died. Clara sat nearby as he pulled out old photographs, concert programs, even a yellowed journal filled with his mother's handwriting. "She played at the Lincoln Center," he murmured, 4 times. "I used to hide under the piano while she practiced. She always said music was the language of memory." Clara smiled. "She sounds like someone who would have adored her grandchildren." "She would have." He turned to her, a thought forming behind his eyes. "I want to take you somewhere." Where? He hesitated, then said, "Back to where it all began." 2 days later, they arrived in New York. Clara wasn't sure how Ethan had arranged the trip, doctor approval, logistics, everything, but somehow he had made it possible. She wore a long navy dress, her belly prominent beneath the fabric. He wore a simple grey suit. They looked like a couple attending a gala, but their purpose was more intimate. The Lincoln Center stood like a cathedral beneath the Manhattan sky. As they stepped inside, the memories rushed in. "This was your dream," Ethan said softly. Clara nodded, running her hand along the velvet wall as they passed the auditorium. "It still is. I pulled every string I had," he said. "They've given you the stage. Just us. For an hour." Her breath caught. Ethan led her gently toward the center of the stage. A single spotlight hung above, illuminating the grand piano and the cello already waiting for her. She turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want our children to know that their mother never gave up on her dream, even when life tried to steal it." She stepped forward, settled into the chair, and lifted the bow. The sound that followed was not perfect. Her hands trembled, her breath faltered, but it was raw, honest, alive. She played the piece she had written while still in Boston, a piece without a name. It began like a lullaby, grew into a storm, and resolved in a single soft note that lingered like a prayer. When she finished, Ethan was crying. "I want to remember that sound forever," he said. She walked to him and placed the cello back in its case. "Then stay long enough to hear it again." That night, they returned to their hotel near Central Park. Ethan fell asleep with his head in her lap, and for the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to hope. The next morning, that hope cracked. Ethan collapsed in the hallway on his way to the elevator. A seizure. Paramedics came quickly. Clara rode with him to Mount Sinai, her hands pressed to her stomach, whispering to the twins, "Stay strong, little ones. Daddy needs us now." The next 24 hours blurred into alarms, white coats, and prayers. Dr. Renner arrived from Chicago, summoned by a frantic call. He reviewed the scans. The tumor had swelled again. The trial had worked, but the effect was temporary. They could operate, a last resort, but the risks were brutal. Ethan might not survive the surgery. Clara sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall under a sea of wires. "You promised me more time," she whispered. Ethan stirred, eyes fluttering open. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "Don't be." She grasped his hand. "You gave me everything. I'm not done yet." "You might be," she whispered, voice breaking. "No." He looked at her with a strength that stunned her. "If I don't do this, I'll fade. Slowly, painfully. I don't want that. I want to try, even if it means risking everything. I want to try." She kissed his forehead. "Then I'll be waiting when you wake up." They took him into surgery at dawn. Clara sat in the chapel, her hands resting on her belly, praying not just for survival, but for peace, for clarity, for the courage to let go if she had to, and the strength to fight if she didn't. The surgery lasted 7 hours. When Dr. Renner emerged, his face was unreadable. "He made it through," he said. "He's in recovery now. The tumor was more aggressive than we thought, but we removed a portion. We'll need to wait to see how he responds." Clara broke into tears, a sound caught between relief and terror. Later that evening, she stepped into his room. Ethan was pale, silent, but breathing. She sat beside him, her hands sliding into his. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Come back to us." And then his fingers twitched, eyes slowly opened. She gasped. Ethan, a faint smile curled on his lips. "I told you, not done yet." She laughed through her tears, kissed his knuckles, and leaned her head against his hand. They had no guarantees, but in that moment, they had breath, touch, time, and for now, that was everything. 3 months later, the wind carried the scent of magnolias across the lawn of the Whitestone estate. The garden had changed, just as its owner had. What had once been a sculpted, sterile landscape was now vibrant and a little wild, with daffodils stretching toward the sun and bees humming lazily between petals. Clara sat beneath the arbor, her arms full, her chest quiet with a kind of peace she hadn't believed in before. Arya and Cord slept nestled against her, their newborn breaths warm and rhythmic. Each carried a fragment of her eyes, her hands, but also the sharp cheekbones and calm stare of the man they called Dada, long before they ever spoke. Inside the house, Ethan Whitestone stood at the mirror, adjusting a dark tie. He moved more slowly now, his steps careful, one hand often gripping furniture for balance, but he stood. He was still here. The surgery had not erased the tumor, but it had bought them time more than they dared to hope for. Enough for the twins' birth. Enough for Ethan to witness his daughter's first cry and the curl of his son's tiny fingers around his thumb. Enough for moments. And for Ethan, that had become more than enough. He stepped outside, squinting against the light, and walked toward Clara, his face lit up at the sight of them. "Hey," he said, his voice a bit hoarse. "You all ready?" Clara looked up and smiled. "We're always ready." The day marked a new chapter. Clara was set to perform again, her first concert since New York, but this time it wasn't just a return to the stage. It was a reintroduction to the woman she had become, not just a cellist, not just a mother, and not just the widow-in-waiting fate had once promised her she'd become. but someone still writing her music on her own terms. The venue was intimate. A benefit concert at the Chicago Symphony Center, a program in support of young musicians from underserved communities. Ethan had helped establish the foundation. Clara would be its inaugural voice. In the green room, Clara ran her fingers along the cello's neck, breathing in the quiet before the curtain. Her nerves flickered not out of fear, but reverence. Ethan stepped inside, holding a bouquet of lilies and lavender. "For luck," he said. She smiled. "You're not supposed to see me before I go on, like a wedding." "Well," he said, lowering himself slowly into the chair beside her. "Then I suppose we've never done things traditionally." She nodded toward the bouquet. "Did you grow these in the back garden?" "They started blooming the day we brought the twins home." Clara blinked back emotion. "You should be the one on stage." He touched her hand gently. "I already had my stage. This is yours." When the curtain lifted, the applause came like a warm tide. Clara stepped into the spotlight, cello cradled against her. She closed her eyes and began to play. The first note soared like a whisper across a canyon, soft but sure. Then came the climb, the aching reach toward something lost and found again. The melody she performed had no name, but the audience would later describe it as a symphony of survival, an echo of someone who had touched death but chose life again and again. In the audience, Ethan sat cradling the twins. His eyes never left her. He didn't see a woman who had saved him. He saw the woman who had stood when he couldn't, who gave music to moments that words failed to contain, who had loved him not despite his brokenness, but because of it. As the final note rang out, the room stilled, and then came the standing ovation. Clara bowed once, then looked to the balcony where Ethan stood, children in arms, tears in his eyes. She didn't wave. She simply smiled. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Ethan led Clara into the garden. Fairy lights sparkled between branches. A cello-shaped cake waited beside 2 glasses of champagne, and beneath the arbor, a table stood, adorned with a velvet box. She raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" He reached for the box and opened it. Inside was a ring symbol, elegant, white gold. At its center sat a blue sapphire, the same color as the first dress she wore when they met in his office. She gasped softly. "I never gave you one," he said. "Not when we signed the contract, not when we learned to love each other. And I think that's because I didn't understand what love meant until I almost lost it." He dropped to one knee slowly, shakily, but with purpose. "I'm not asking because we need a ceremony. I'm asking because I want the right to choose you, not out of necessity, not out of survival, but because you are the greatest thing I have ever known." Clara's eyes brimmed. "Ethan ... Clara Jensen," he said, voice trembling. "Will you marry me again? Not as part of a deal, but as a man who is learning, every single day, what it means to live fully." She stepped closer and placed her hand over his heart. "Yes," she said. He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood. They kissed, not like a beginning or an end, but like the continuation of something bigger than either of them. The wedding took place a week later, in the garden, with only a handful of friends and the twins tucked in white linen cradles beneath the trees. Mrs. Winslow wept through the entire ceremony. Dr. Renner gave the toast. And Clara played a duet with herself, one cello recorded, one live, each voice speaking to the past and the present in harmony. Time continued, as it always does. There were hard days, days when Ethan couldn't lift the babies, when the tumor whispered reminders of its presence. But there were also ordinary miracles. The first time Cord laughed, the day Aria stood without wobbling, the night Clara's music was featured on NPR. Ethan lived long enough to see the foundation grow. He taught the children how to count by counting stars with them at night. He made Clara laugh when she felt the weight of too many sleepless hours. He whispered stories into her hair while she slept, and when the day finally came quietly, without pain, in his sleep, he left, not with unfinished dreams, but with a heart full of them. Clara buried him beneath the magnolia tree in the garden. His journal sat atop the grave, wrapped in the same navy ribbon that once tied her cello bow. Years later, Aria and Cord would sit at her feet, wide-eyed, as she told them who their father was. Not just the CEO, not just the man who built their home, but the man who taught her how to hear the music in silence.